The Roman Empire was no stranger to cultural appropriation. And with the Greeks being one of their favorite targets, it only makes sense that there were some similarities between the two pantheons. The Romans loved the Greek gods so much that they even gave them their own temples and shrines in their cities. But how different are the Roman gods from their Greek counterparts? Well, join me today as we discuss all of the differences between the Greek and Roman gods, including their origins, powers, symbols, and more. As always, spoilers abound, so let's get into it. Let's begin by talking about where these deities come from. As we all know, the Greeks didn't invent everything, and most of their beliefs and customs came from the Minoans and Mycenaeans before them. However, when the civilizations collapsed around 1200 BC, most of the old gods were forgotten, and new ones took their places. These gods were more anthropomorphic and had characteristics that were more similar to the humans who worshipped them. So, while there may have been some connections between the old gods and the new, for the most part, they can be considered separate. Then when Alexander the Great spread Greek influence across the Near East, he brought his pantheon of gods with him. Since the Greeks didn't wipe out every culture as they spread their influence, there was often syncretism between the local gods and the Greek ones. This is how the Egyptian goddess Isis became synonymous with the Greek goddess Demeter, and why the Syrian goddess Atargatis became associated with the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So what does this mean for Rome? Well, since Rome wasn't directly influenced by Greece, the only way that they would have had contact with the Greek gods would have been through stories brought back by travelers or soldiers, and through contact with the Etruscans. We don't know much about the nature of the Roman religion before the founding of the city, but we do know that they believed in a number of gods, both good and evil, and that they held festivals in their honor. When the Romans eventually did come into regular contact with the Greeks, after defeating them in the Pyrrhic War, they saw many similarities between their own gods and those of the Greeks, so they decided to identify them as one and the same. They also incorporated some of the Greek myths into their own tradition and gave the Greek gods temples and shrines throughout their empire. However, the Romans never fully adopted the Greek religion. They kept their own traditions and beliefs and only allowed the Greek gods to share their pantheon, because they were either too similar to their own gods to be ignored, or they offered something unique that the Romans wanted. Now that we know how the Roman gods came to be, let's talk about the differences between them and the Greeks. The first thing that you may notice is the names. Even though the Romans identified the Greek gods with their own gods, they never called them by the same name. For example, Zeus was known as Jupiter, Poseidon as Neptune, Hades as Pluto, and Apollo as Apollo. The Romans rarely used the s ending for male gods and the ina ending for female gods like the Greeks did. Instead, they preferred to use endings like ios and a. But the name changes weren't arbitrary. There was actually a reason behind them. When the Romans took the Greek gods into their pantheon, they often gave them Latin equivalents. This was partly done to make it easier for the Romans to remember who they were, but it was also done to emphasize the differences between the two pantheons. For example, Zeus was the supreme leader of the cosmos in Greek mythology, but Jupiter was the king of the gods and the sky in Roman mythology. And while both gods were associated with lightning, Zeus was more associated with thunder and Jupiter with rain. In fact, in Greek mythology, Zeus was known as the father of gods and men, but Jupiter was seen as more of a lawmaker and ruler. Similarly, Poseidon was the god of the sea and earthquakes in Greek mythology, but Neptune was the god of the sea and protector of sailors in Roman mythology. Also, while Poseidon could be a little bit of a trickster, Neptune was more serious and more closely associated with tyranny. Another reason the Romans changed the names of the Greek gods is because they didn't want to be reminded of their former enemies. When the Romans conquered Greece, they brought many Greek customs and traditions back to Rome, but they didn't want to identify too closely with their enemy. By changing the names of the gods, they were able to distance themselves from the Greeks and emphasize their own Roman identity. This is also why the Romans never worshipped the Greek gods in the same way that the Greeks did. They didn't have the same festivals or rituals, and they never associated the Greek gods with the natural world in the same way. Instead, the Romans saw the Greek gods as foreign interlopers who didn't belong in their pantheon. They viewed them as objects of ridicule and mocked them in their literature and art. In fact, the Romans were so critical of the Greek gods that they even made fun of their appearance. According to Roman mythology, Jupiter had 72 children, but in Greek mythology, Zeus only had 12. The Romans used this to make fun of the Greeks and said that they worshipped a crippled god. Despite these differences, though, the Romans did learn a lot from the Greeks, and they incorporated many of their customs and traditions into their own religion. For example, the Romans adopted the Greek alphabet and used it to write their own language. They also adopted many of the Greek gods and goddesses and made them their own by giving them Roman names and attributes. For example, the Romans adopted Athena, the goddess of wisdom, from the Greeks, but they changed her name to Minerva. They also adopted Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, from the Greeks, but they changed her name to Venus. While the Romans adopted many of the Greek gods and goddesses, they didn't adopt all of them. There were a few Greek deities that the Romans didn't want in their pantheon, and there's a few reasons for this. First of all, the Romans didn't want to adopt any gods that were too similar to their own. For example, the Romans didn't adopt Hades, the god of the underworld, because he was too similar to Pluto, the Roman god of the underworld. They also didn't adopt Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, because she was too similar to Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth. Finally, the Romans didn't adopt any gods that they saw as immoral. For example, they didn't adopt Ares, the god of war, because he was too violent and bloodthirsty. Nor did they adopt any of the lesser-known gods and goddesses, such as the Titans or the Satyrs. One interesting thing about the Roman religion is that the Romans didn't have any concept of hell. They believed that when a person died, their soul went to the underworld, which was ruled by Pluto. However, the Romans didn't believe that Pluto was an evil god. They saw him as a just god who punished the wicked and rewarded the virtuous. Therefore, they didn't have a concept of hell as a place where people were tormented for eternity. Instead, they believed that the underworld was a place where people were judged and then sent to either Elysium or the fields of Asphodel. Elysium was a place where the virtuous went to live with the gods, while the fields of Asphodel was a place where the average person went to live a peaceful existence. Another difference between the Greek and Roman religions is the role of prophecy. In Greek religion, prophecy played a major role. The Greeks believed that the gods often spoke to humans through their dreams or through the mouths of prophets. Prophecy was seen as a way for the gods to communicate their will to mortals. However, in Roman religion, prophecy played a much smaller role. The Romans didn't believe that the gods spoke to humans in the same way, and they didn't have any major prophets. Instead, the Romans relied on their own reason and their own experience to figure out what was right. Overall, the Roman gods were a mix of Greek and native Italian gods. The Romans didn't fully adopt the Greek pantheon, but they did take some of the gods and make them their own by giving them Roman names and attributes. The Romans didn't want to be too closely associated with the Greeks, so they changed the names of many of the gods, and they often made fun of them in their literature and art. Despite these differences, the Romans did learn a lot from the Greeks, and the Greek influence can be seen throughout Roman religion. So while the Romans didn't have the same gods as the Greeks, they did have some similarities. And that's all for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button below. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another video.